The frame is grainy but unmistakable. Shot through a wide-angle electro-optical sensor from several thousand feet, the footage shows a Russian Panzer I air defense vehicle sitting on a dirt track somewhere in southern Ukraine. The vehicle is stationary, its radar dish rotating, its crew almost certainly unaware of what is above them. Then the screen flares white. A secondary explosion blooms as the vehicle's own ammunition cooks off. The whole sequence, from weapons release to secondary detonation, takes roughly 8 seconds. When the smoke clears, there is nothing left of the Panzer but a burning chassis and a thermal scar on the earth. That sensor footage came from a Bayraktar TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicle. In the spring of 2022, that kind of footage was playing on a loop across the world's news networks, intelligence briefing rooms, and defense ministry conference tables. A Turkish-built drone, purchased on a budget that a major Western Air Force would spend on a handful of guided munitions, was humiliating one of the largest conventional militaries on Earth. Then it wasn't. By midsummer of 2022, the TB2 had largely vanished from the active Ukrainian offensive effort. Its starring role in the conflict ended almost as dramatically as it had begun. What happened, how it happened, and what it ultimately means for the relationship between unmanned aerial systems and the electromagnetic environment they operate in is the analytical story this episode addresses. The Bayraktar TB2 is not a simple hero or a simple cautionary tale. It is a precise case study in how rapidly the character of a technological advantage can change once a well-resourced adversary learns to adapt. To understand the rise, you have to understand what the TB2 actually is. The Bayraktar TB2 is a medium-altitude, long-endurance, unmanned aerial vehicle designed and manufactured by Baykar Makina of Turkey. It has a wingspan of approximately 12 meters and weighs around 650 kilograms at maximum takeoff. Its service ceiling is reported at around 25,000 feet, though typical combat operations are conducted at much lower altitudes depending on the threat environment. Its endurance is approximately 27 hours, giving operators the kind of persistent surveillance capability that fundamentally changes how a ground commander understands the situation below. The system relies on a ground control station, a data link to transmit commands and receive live video, and satellite communications for beyond line-of-sight operations. Its sensor suite, an electro-optical, infrared, and laser designator turret manufactured by Aselsan, allows operators to detect, track, and engage targets with significant standoff. The weapons load is typically 4 rockets and AMAML, or AMC laser-guided micromunitions, each weighing between 6 and 22 kilograms. Against soft-skin vehicles, artillery pieces, supply convoys, and radar systems, the AM series is more than adequate. Ukraine's acquisition of the TB2 predated the full-scale invasion. Kiev signed its first contract with Baykar in 2019 and began taking delivery before Russia's assault in February 2022. The decision was controversial at the time because Russia protested the sale. Those protests turned out to be exactly the kind of strategic indicator that Ukraine's defense planners should have found encouraging. Russia was worried about the TB2 for a reason. When the invasion began in the pre-dawn hours of February 24, 2022, Ukraine's TB2 fleet went to work almost immediately. The early operations were remarkable in their audacity and their effectiveness. Ukrainian operators flew TB2 sorties against Russian armored columns advancing from multiple directions, targeting not just frontline vehicles but the logistical infrastructure sustaining a mechanized offensive. Fuel trucks were struck, artillery batteries were located and destroyed. Air defense assets were attacked in a sequence that analysts would later describe as systematic degradation of Russian ground-based air defense at the operational level. The initial success was partly a product of Russian overconfidence. Russian planners had evidently concluded that their air defense network would be sufficiently dense to neutralize any threat Ukraine could field. The S-400 and S-300 batteries that form Russia's strategic air defense backbone are genuinely formidable against high-performance aircraft at medium and high altitude. The Pantsir S-1 short-range systems were designed to handle exactly the kind of lower-altitude threats that the TB2 represents. On paper, the layered Russian air defense architecture should have made TB2 operations extremely costly from day one. In practice, the system had critical gaps. The Russian advance was moving so quickly on so many axes simultaneously that maintaining a coherent overlapping air defense umbrella across the entire front was operationally extremely difficult. Air defense units that might have been well positioned for a deliberate offensive found themselves in march formations on unfamiliar roads, their radar systems in transit modes, their crews not necessarily at full readiness. Critically, the TB2 operates at altitudes that exploit a documented seam between the engagement envelopes of different Russian air defense systems. Short-range systems like the Pantsir S-1 are optimized for threats at very low to medium altitude at close range. Longer-range systems like the Bukum 2 and S-300 series are optimized for higher altitude threats. The TB2, operating at altitudes that vary between roughly 5,000 and 15,000 feet depending on the mission, can at times thread between these envelopes, particularly when the defending force is in motion and electronic coordination between the layers breaks down. The tempo of the opening phase exacerbated these gaps enormously. Ukrainian electronic warfare and cyber capabilities appear to have contributed as well, in ways that are difficult to quantify from open sources, but that multiple analysts, including those associated with the Royal United Services Institute in London, have pointed to as significant factors in Russian air defense degradation during the invasion's earliest phase. The result was a run of TB2 combat footage that became globally viral. Videos of Panzer BA-1 vehicles, book launch vehicles, field artillery systems, and logistics trucks being struck by TB2-launched munitions circulated on social media and were authenticated by open-source analysts. Some of the most widely viewed footage from this period came from operations in the vicinity of Kherson, Mykolaiv, and the approaches to Kyiv. Snake Island became one of the defining symbols of the conflict's early mythology, and the TB2 was central to it. The island, officially known as Mini Island, sits roughly 35 kilometers off the Ukrainian coast in the Black Sea. Russia seized it on the first day of the invasion. In the months that followed, Ukraine used the TB2 to conduct sustained harassment operations against Russian forces on and around the island. TB2 strikes are documented against Russian patrol boats, logistics vessels, and air defense systems attempting to hold the position. When Russia withdrew from Snake Island in late June 2022, characterizing the departure as a goodwill gesture, Ukrainian military spokespeople and most independent analysts attributed it in significant part to sustained TB2 pressure, among other fires. Perhaps the most strategically significant episode in which the TB2 played a documented supporting role was the sinking of the Moskva on April 13 and 14, 2022. The Moskva was the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, a Slava-class guided missile cruiser. It was struck and sunk by two Ukrainian R-360 Neptune anti-ship missiles. What is publicly documented is that a TB2 was operating in the vicinity of the Moskva in the period before the Neptune strikes. USNI News analysis noted that the Moskva's fire control radars appear to have been inactive when the Neptune struck, and analysts have suggested the TB2's presence may have complicated the ship's sensor picture in the critical window before impact. Whether that constitutes deliberate coordination or a coincidence that was tactically exploited, public sources cannot definitively resolve. What is clear is that the TB2 was present, and the Moskva's defense failed. The cultural moment that followed was extraordinary. A Ukrainian folk song celebrating the Bayraktar by name became a genuine phenomenon, played at rallies and shared millions of times. The drone became a symbol not just of military capability, but of the possibility that a smaller country could stand up to a much larger aggressor using technology and ingenuity. That symbolism had real political weight in Western capitals at a moment when the narrative around the invasion's likely outcome was still forming. And then the environment changed. The shift was not instantaneous, and it was not the result of any single Russian adaptation. It was a convergence of several adjustments that together fundamentally altered the threat calculus for TB2 operations. Understanding what changed requires understanding the TB2's vulnerability profile. The system flies relatively slowly, cruise speed of around 130 kilometers per hour, and a maximum of roughly 220. It presents a manageable radar cross-section at typical operating altitudes. It relies on data links for control, on GPS for navigation, and on laser designation for weapons employment. Each of these dependencies represents a potential attack surface for an adversary with capable electronic warfare systems. Russia possesses, at least on paper, some of the world's most sophisticated ground-based electronic warfare infrastructure. Systems like the Krasuka 4 broadband noise jamming complex are designed specifically to suppress airborne radar systems and degrade satellite communications links. The R-330 Jatel targets GPS and satellite phone signals that a TB2 depends on for navigation at extended range. The RB-341V Lear-3 deploys cellular jammers from unmanned platforms, illustrating the depth of Russia's investment in the electromagnetic contest. As Russian forces stabilized their defensive lines in eastern and southern Ukraine through May and June of 2022, Russia was able to concentrate its electronic warfare assets along the contact line in a way that had simply not been possible during the chaos of the opening advance. TB2 operators who had been able to find gaps in the Russian defensive architecture during the invasion's early confusion now faced fundamentally different conditions. Russian air defense also adapted procedurally. The early losses of Panzer systems, widely documented and deeply embarrassing, triggered a genuine reconsideration of how these assets were deployed and protected. Layering air defense more carefully, ensuring Panzer vehicles were not left isolated without organic radar search capability, and tightening coordination between short-range and medium-range systems all contributed pivoted to a more hostile environment for the TB2. Ukrainian officials and Western analysts began reporting increased TB2 losses by late spring and early summer of 2022. The precise number of TB2s Ukraine lost is difficult to verify from open sources. Ukrainian officials were understandably not eager to publicize losses of a system that had become a national symbol. Russian claims of TB2 kills were frequently exaggerated or fabricated, as is standard in this conflict's information environment. What the OSINT community established through verified loss footage and the geographic and temporal patterns of TB2 operations is that Ukraine's use of the TB2 in offensive strikes against the main Russian defensive lines fell sharply by mid-summer of 2022 and remained essentially dormant as an ACE and Asians Rogolbev's offensive instrument for an extended period thereafter. What is certain is the behavioral change. Ukraine stopped flying TB2 strike missions against defended Russian positions along the Eastern Front. The drone had not been defeated technologically, its airframe was not obsolete, its sensors had not failed. What had failed was the permissive environment it needed to operate effectively. The TB2 is a system designed for surveillance and strike in environments where the adversary lacks modern, well-integrated air defense and electronic warfare capability. Against a force that has adapted and concentrated its electromagnetic and kinetic air defense layers, the TB2 becomes extremely vulnerable. Russia stabilized along its defensive lines by midsummer 2022, and bringing its EW assets to bear in earnest was no longer the confused, overextended force of the opening weeks. There is an important lesson here about how analysts and policymakers should think about unmanned aerial systems in general. The early TB2 successes in Syria and Libya, and Azerbaijan's devastating use of TB2s against Armenian forces in the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh conflict had established a narrative of the TB2 as a paradigm-shifting capability. Armenian air defense lacked the depth, the electronic warfare enablers, and the procedural sophistication to counter the threat effectively. The resulting footage drove a wave of global interest in the platform. What the Ukraine experience demonstrated is that the permissive conditions that made those earlier successes possible were specific to those contexts. The TB2 was never a silver bullet. It was a capable system operating in environments that happened to be permissive enough for it to be effective. When the environment changed, its effectiveness changed with it. The shift in Ukrainian strategy that followed was itself analytically significant. Recognizing that the TB2 was no longer viable against the main Russian defensive line, Ukraine accelerated the development and deployment of smaller, cheaper, and harder-to-detect unmanned systems. The FPV drone, the loitering munition derivatives, and the various one-way attack systems that came to define the conflict's middle and later phases were in many ways direct responses to the same electronic warfare environment that had neutralized the TB2. A small, cheap FPV drone offers a much smaller radar cross-section, produces minimal electronic emissions, and when built with analog video systems rather than digital, may be significantly more resistant to jamming. The shift from the TB2 to the FPV drone as Ukraine's primary tactical unmanned platform was not a step backward in capability. It was an adaptation to the electromagnetic realities of the conflict as those realities had come to be understood. This does not mean the TB2 disappeared from Ukrainian operations entirely. Throughout 2022 and into 2023, TB2s continued to operate in lower threat environments, primarily over the Black Sea and in areas where Russian air defense coverage was less dense. The system continued to provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance value even when its strike role was curtailed. A 27-hour endurance unmanned platform with a capable sensor suite is not made useless by a hostile air defense environment. It simply has to operate differently, staying farther from the threat, accepting that its strike utility will be limited to periods and locations where the local air defense posture permits. By 2024 and into 2025, Ukrainian operators had resumed more regular TB2 operations in specific geographic contexts. Areas north of Kherson Oblast, across the Dnipro, offered windows where Russian air defense coverage had not fully reconstituted after the losses of 2022. The Kharkiv front, depending on the period and the local tactical situation, similarly offered occasional corridors where TB2 operations could be conducted at acceptable risk. These were not a return to the uninhibited offensive operations of spring 2022. They were the careful, threat-calibrated employment of a system that Ukrainian operators now understood with far greater nuance than at the outset. What changed between 2022 and 2024 was not the TB2 itself. What changed was the operational doctrine around it. Ukrainian operators, having paid a steep price in lost aircraft and curtailed operations to learn the system's viable employment envelope, developed a much more sophisticated understanding of when and where the TB2 could be used effectively. operating it in lower threat corridors, integrating its ISR output with other strike systems rather than relying on it as a primary strike platform. These represent a more mature and sustainable approach than the aggressive, opportunistic employment of the invasion's first weeks. There is something analytically important in the TB2's resilience as a useful platform even after its dramatic tactical defeat by Russia's EW environment. A system that can no longer safely operate against the main defensive line can still provide enormous value in surveillance, in lower threat strike missions, and as a sensor feeder for other weapons. The TB2's endurance means it can maintain persistent presence over an area of interest for a duration that no other platform in Ukraine's inventory can match at equivalent cost. That persistent presence shapes the battlefield by complicating Russian logistics movements, enabling rapid queuing of other strike assets, and degrading the freedom of action of forces who know they are being watched. Bayraktar itself drew lessons from the Ukrainian experience. The company accelerated development of the TB3, a heavier carrier-capable variant, and the Casualty, a larger platform with a higher service ceiling, more payload, and reportedly improved resistance to electronic warfare. Whether these newer platforms will address the core vulnerability the TB2 exposed, its dependence on data links and GPS navigation in a jammed environment, is a question the open-source community will watch closely as they see operational use. The broader analytical lesson extends beyond any single platform. The TB2's trajectory in Ukraine illustrates a cycle that has appeared repeatedly in the history of air power and electronic warfare. A newly deployed system achieves dramatic early success in a context where the adversary has not adapted to it. The adversary then adapts, deploying countermeasures and concentrating assets that can defeat the new system. The original system's effectiveness declines, sometimes sharply. This drives adaptation by the original operator, who either modifies the system, changes the doctrine around it, or shifts to a platform that exploits a new gap. This cycle played out between radar and electronic countermeasures in the Second World War, between surface-to-air missiles and air power during Vietnam, and between precision munitions and hardening techniques in every conflict since. The TB2 in Ukraine is the most clearly documented and rapidly completed recent iteration of this pattern. What makes the Ukraine case particularly valuable for analysts is the speed at which the cycle completed. In roughly 3 months, from late February to midsummer 2022, a system went from dominating its operational environment to being effectively neutralized within it. The speed of that transition reflects both the sophistication of Russia's electronic warfare capability when properly deployed and concentrated, and the adaptability of Russian air defense operators at the tactical level, even during a period when Russia's strategic failures were catastrophic. Russia's high command made fatal errors that left its forces exposed in the opening weeks, but Russian EW units and air defense operators are highly trained professionals who, once given the right conditions, did so with real effect. The song about the Bayraktar still plays in Ukraine. The drone still flies. The lessons it taught about the relationship between unmanned aerial systems and the electromagnetic environment they inhabit will be studied in defense ministries and military academies for years. The TB2 did not win Ukraine's war. It did not lose it either. What it did was provide a precise, documented, and analyzable case study in how military technology operates at the intersection of tactical opportunity, electronic warfare, and adaptation. For anyone trying to understand how the next generation of unmanned systems will be employed and countered on future battlefields, that case study is worth examining in careful detail. The Bayraktar TB2 remains in service. It continues to accumulate flight hours and, in the right conditions, operational results. The frame of the burning Panzer is still there in the archive, still remarkable for what it captured. But what it captured was a moment in a specific context, not a permanent condition of the battlefield. Understanding the difference between those two things is what separates rigorous analysis from the kind of narrative that sells equipment and starts bad wars.